Hi, we're out on the range today, so please bear with gunfire you hear in the background. Now, a lot of viewers have asked to see a comparison between 357 SIG and 357 Magnum, so here we are. However, this subject comes with quite a few caveats and yabbits. Let me cover two of them right now. One of them is, we've already done comparisons between 357 SIG and 40 Smith & Wesson, between 357 Magnum and 9mm, and the list goes on. So in comparing the SIG to the Magnum, we're going to have some redundancy. I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but please bear with what redundancy there is. Another one is, the only type of ammunition I'm going to shoot today is this Remington green and white box. In going to at least a half dozen stores trying to find ammunition for today's comparison, what I found was that there's various brands and configurations available for SIG that aren't available for Magnum and vice versa. So the only way I could get the same brand and the same bullet weight and at least a similar bullet configuration, jacketed hollow point versus semi-jacketed hollow point, was the Remington green and white box, so that's what we're going to shoot today. Now before I go any farther, let me show you a close-up of these two rounds. Now on your left is a 9x19, then the 357 SIG, the 357 Magnum, and a 38 Special. Now the Magnum might not seem a lot longer than the Special, but look at the difference in case length. That's significant. Also, the Magnum is a lot longer than the 357 SIG, but remember the SIG is a necked casing. One other caveat I want to cover is that so I don't have to use the word 357 dozens of times, I'm just going to refer to the SIG and the Magnum. And our test guns for today will be this Ruger Security 6 with a 4-inch barrel and this Glock Model 31 with a 4¼ barrel. I may shoot one or two other guns later, but these will be the main ones. And one of the first questions we want to answer is, how do the Magnum and the SIG compare for power? Well, let's take our 125 grain semi-jacketed hollow point and our 125 grain jacketed hollow point to the chronograph and see if we can answer that. And we'll start with the 357 Magnum. $14.58. $14.40. $14.46. $14.57. And $14.63. Now let's see how that compares to the 357 SIG. $13.85. $13.77. $13.83. $13.85. And $13.95. Now let's go crunch the numbers. Well, we crunched the numbers, and here's an opportunity to point out one of those caveats I was talking about. Chronographs don't always agree with each other, and various environmental factors like elevation, barometric pressure, and ambient temperature can affect chronograph results. Now that having been said, with our Magnum we got a mean velocity of 1,452. With the SIG we got 1,385. So that is 67 feet per second more. That's definitely more. But is it enough more to make a real difference? Well, you may have heard me say in the past that 60 feet per second more was significantly more. And it is, in my opinion, when you're talking about velocities down there around 1,000, maybe even 1,200 feet per second. But when we get up here to 1,400 feet per second, is 67 feet per second more really significant? A couple of things on that. One, recently a viewer was kind enough to point out that I was using the word significant incorrectly, because these differences aren't enough to be what he called a statistical significant difference. Okay, I didn't use that word in the classroom mathematical statistical sense. I used the word significant in the sense that after decades of shooting handguns at distances of 50, 100, 200 meters, shooting targets like soda jugs and cinder blocks and squirrels and rabbits and deer, the list goes on ad nauseum, I found that quite often 60 feet per second more can make a difference that is measurable, and it's enough of a difference to make a difference. Bigger wound channels, shorter incapacitation curves, so on. But up here where we're talking about velocities around 1,400 feet per second, I think it's questionable as to whether or not 67 feet per second more is significantly more. And when you take into consideration that you can get more powerful versions of 357 SIG and more powerful versions of 357 Magnum and different configurations of firearms, especially if you were talking about different barrel lengths, there's a lot of 357 Magnums that have both longer and shorter barrels than this one. Those kind of factors are probably going to make a lot bigger difference in which one of these is really more powerful or how much difference there is, more so than just being Magnum versus SIG. So to see if our 67 feet per second more velocity really makes a difference, we'll shoot the meat target. Now forgive the redundancy, but for those who haven't seen it before, this is pig ears to simulate skin, followed by a pork chop pectoral, pork ribs, our bag of oranges lung tissue, more pork ribs on the back, 4 layers of t-shirt on the front, 4 layers on the back, and followed as always by the new and improved high-tech fleece bullet stop. And we'll shoot from 7 yards, and we'll start with our 357 SIG. So how'd we do? Well, we see a lot of damage to our ribs in the front. Obliterated our orange lung tissue. All the bullets went through the ribs on the back, and they were all stopped by the 6th, 7th, 8th layer of fleece. So we see a lot of damage and quite a bit of penetration. Now let me show you a close-up of what the projectiles look like. And you can see that the expansion of these 357 SIG projectiles is very good and very uniform. Now we've got a new meat target set up, and we'll shoot it with our 357 Magnum. And occasionally people ask about shooting glasses. Yes, I do wear them when I shoot targets like this. I just usually take them off before I get back on camera. So how'd we do with the Magnum? Well, we see some extensive damage to our ribs on the front. Just fragmented our orange lung tissue. A lot of these fragments are carried through into our ribs on the back, and we see some big holes back here. A little bit of inconsistent penetration into the fleece bullet stop. One bullet went through to the 20th layer, a couple of bullets were in the 5th or 6th layer. So a little bit of inconsistency there, but we see a lot of damage and a lot of penetration, and just my subjective point of view, it looks like more damage with this than we saw with the SIG. Now let me show you a close-up of these projectiles. Now I lost one of these projectiles in the snow, but with these we see a lot of expansion. We also saw some fragmentation. There were bits of bullets scattered throughout the meat target. Well, looking at the results of the meat target, I can see that both of these calibers are highly effective. And it looked to me like the 357 Magnum a little bit more so, and that has to do with the slightly greater velocity and perhaps some differences in projectile design. But which one is really going to be more powerful and more effective, I have to reiterate, will have just as much to do with firearms and ammunition choices as it does with the calibers themselves. So which one of these is really better? Well, that takes us back to a very old debate. Now, 357 Magnum will almost always be a revolver, while 357 SIG will almost always be an autoloader. And so that brings us to the debate of revolver versus autoloader, more so than the debate over the calibers. And revolver versus autoloader is a subject I could go on about for hours, but I'm going to try to condense it to just a few minutes and hit some of the high points. Now, one of those high points is capacity. There are 5, 6, 7, 8 shot revolvers, but most revolvers are going to have a capacity of 6, while with autoloaders, capacities of 15 are very common. And last I checked, 15 is a lot more than 6. Not only that, for most shooters, they can reload an autoloader faster than they can a revolver. Let me show you what I mean. Now you'll notice I've changed revolvers. I can reload this one faster than I can the other one. And what I've got in here is 5 empty casings and 1 live round. So I'm going to shoot 1 shot, reload with the speed loader, shoot 1 more shot, and then we'll time from the first shot to the second. Now let's see how that compares to the autoloader. And with our autoloader, I'll shoot one shot, reload with another magazine, shoot one more shot, and again we'll time from the first shot to the second. Was that a little faster? I'd say so. Now in that reloading drill I mentioned switching revolvers because this one is faster. The reality is, of all the revolvers I own, this is the one that I can reload the fastest. While of all the autoloaders I have, the Glock is far from the fastest for me. You also saw that the slide locked back on the autoloader. If I had reloaded before running it completely dry, I could have made that reload just a little bit faster. So what I did was I tried to give the revolver some advantages, and even having done that, the autoloader was still faster. And so when you take into consideration the autoloader's greater magazine capacity and ability to be reloaded faster, in the comparison of which of these two platforms can put the most rounds downrange in a hurry, the autoloader is the clear winner by a wide margin. However, that's almost completely irrelevant. Now when I say that, people get very angry with me, but let me explain what I mean. In a legitimate self-defense, citizen-involved shooting, it is extremely difficult to come up with accurate statistics as to how many rounds somebody fired. Statistics easy, accurate statistics very hard. And that's a subject I could go on at length about. But to be as concise as I can, we have a presentation on gunfight statistics you can look at. But let me give you a short anecdote to illustrate my point. A long time ago in the city I lived in, there was a mass shooting. Someone took a firearm, went into a crowded establishment, shot a bunch of strangers, a mass shooting. It just so happens I was very well acquainted with the first police officer to arrive on the scene. And so what he told me was, according to the witnesses on the scene and the physical evidence backs them up, what happened was someone with an auto-loading pistol went into a place that was very crowded, emptied a magazine, walked back out the front door. While outside, he reloaded, came back in, emptied his second magazine. But then instead of going out to reload, he stayed right there in the fray to reload, and so while trying to put in his third magazine, some people jumped in, disarmed him, held him for police. Okay, well the next day the newspaper reports that story pretty accurately. But on the subject of how many rounds he fired, what the newspaper reported was not the specific number. They reported that the pistol he had was a 9mm Luger, and went on to report that that has an 8-shot magazine and he'd fired 2 magazines. Okay, so that's 16 rounds. Let's say he topped off, had one in the chamber, that'd be 17. He shot 23 people. Now a lot of people use that newspaper article to make their point of 9mm propensity for overpenetration. No, it may have a propensity for that, but what really happened was the pistol he had, although it was a 9mm, was not a P08 Luger. I don't remember the model number, but it had a 15-shot magazine. He'd fired 30 rounds to shoot 23 people. And so we see a lot of conclusions being drawn on totally erroneous information. And when you're trying to get to how many rounds did someone fire, he really fired 30 or 31, but statistically, a lot of people will say he fired 16 or 17. And I could bore you for an hour with anecdotes on this very point. I could go on about the police officer who, through ignorance or malfeasance, was trying to claim that rock chips in a windshield were bullet holes, or the county coroner who couldn't tell the difference between an ice pick stab wound and a small caliber bullet wound. And sometime when I've got more time to spend on it, I'll tell you the story about the police officer who thought someone had died of a stroke when he actually died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Accurate statistics on how many rounds somebody fires are extremely difficult to get. That having been said, of those few cases that I'm close enough to that I consider the source reliable, numbers like 3, 4, 5 shots are very common, which means that the 6 in most revolvers is going to be enough. And even in cases where someone fires 7, 8, 9 rounds, most of the time those rounds are unnecessary. Now you watch security cam footage, you see something like someone comes into a convenience store and exchanges shots with the clerk. Then realizing his robbery isn't working, he runs back out the door, while clerk fires shot 7, 8, 9 at someone who's already left the establishment, making those shots unnecessary and from a legal standpoint very dubious. So Unless you're one of those people who, no matter what happens, you spaz out and empty your magazine, if you're not that kind of guy, I wouldn't ever say that having more rounds is a bad thing, but it is not the end-all be-all advantage that a lot of people would have you believe. Now, comparing revolver to autoloader, there's one other thing, and that is reliability. Traditionally, people will tell you that revolvers are more reliable than autoloaders, and traditionally they are. However, today's generation of autoloader, if you get a good quality autoloader like a Beretta, a Sig Sauer, or a Glock, the list goes on, and you make sure you've got good quality magazines, you make good ammunition choices, you do proper PMCS, autoloaders are very reliable. And the chances that your autoloading pistol are going to let you down when you really need it are very slim. However, if you put into that comparison something called a shooter-caused malfunction, all of a sudden your revolver becomes a lot more reliable than your autoloader. I can't even begin to count the times I've seen, and I don't mean life or death stuff, I mean just on the range or hunting, where people have aimed in with an autoloading pistol, attempted to fire, and the pistol did not go off for many reasons, primarily because they forgot to load their pistol, forgot to put a round in the chamber, forgot to disengage a safety, or they had one of those autoloaders. This Glock is not one of them, but some autoloaders, if you take the magazine out, it won't fire the round in the chamber, and your magazine becomes just a little bit dislodged, and now you can't even fire the one you have in the chamber. These mishaps are what we call shooter-caused malfunctions, and they occur in autoloaders a lot more than revolvers. So in comparing the two, each has a lot of advantages and a lot of disadvantages. But how about comparing these two in terms of 357 Magnum versus 357 SIG? That adds one other dimension to this, and that is the availability, the versatility, and the cost of ammunition, both for carry and practice. Now, as far as versatility, we saw that in terms of power and effectiveness, these two were pretty close. But there are some people who think that heavy projectiles is where it's at. And for those people, there's ammunition available for a 357 Magnum with 158 grain, 180 grain projectiles. Not so much for 357 SIG. And so you have that greater versatility. As far as availability and cost, there's a lot of stores that just don't have 357 SIG ammo, and of course you can order it online. And when you do, the SIG ammo is typically significantly more expensive than the Magnum ammo. But the real difference as far as an advantage toward a 357 Magnum is when you're talking about training ammunition and the great abundance and fairly low price of .38 special ammunition for training. Not near as much recoil. It doesn't have the sharp report that 357 SIG or 357 Magnum does, and it's a lot less expensive. And that is a big advantage toward the 357 Magnum revolver. So which of these two is better, or which of them is right? You know, really neither. It's just a question of which is right for you. And of course, no one can make that decision for you except you. So as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching the 357 Magnum versus 357 SIG video.